I want to introduce John Anthony. He's one of the foremost experts on this issue. He's done presentations similar to this all over the country. He's been extremely successful, especially in New Jersey, on reversing some of the initiatives that have taken place. I'm going to turn this over to him. This is his show tonight. This is his presentation. We'll talk to you again when it's over.
Thank you, ladies and gentlemen. I appreciate your coming out here this evening to learn a little more about the Sustainable Development and Agenda 21. And I really want to thank the folks that took me over to this cheeseburger. It was absolutely fantastic. I'm definitely going to go out there again. My background, let me tell you just a couple little things. I started as an elementary teacher, then I became a director of marketing for a very large beauty care company in the United States. And around 1889, yeah. And around, it's been a long time. In 1989, I worked under another fellow doing a thing called turnarounds. We went to corporations that were losing money and we turned them into companies that were making money. We'd get jobs, we'd provide them, and bring prosperity to those companies. And then eventually I turned that into a leadership program. And what that has to do with what we're doing right now is really very simple. I taught people when they became leaders that the first thing you have to do if you see a problem or a challenge or something you think ought to be addressed is you have to go back and do the homework. You've got to get the facts, do the due diligence, put those facts in context. Blind facts in and of themselves mean literally nothing. But you have to create a context. And if you then have a clear picture of what to do, you can take action. So what I'm here tonight to show you is some information that I discovered. About a year and a half or 2 years ago, somebody first mentioned this thing called Sustainable Development and Agenda 21 to me. And I had my suspicions about the whole thing. I had a business to run and a lot of other things on my plate. But I did spend about a year researching it. So what you're going to see tonight is a result of that year of research. Now, I looked on both sides of the coin. I talked to many people who, believe this is a huge conspiracy and there's people out to take our land away and steal our sovereignty and our rights. And I talked to people on the other side of the coin. I've talked to people who wrote the strategic plan for New Jersey. They had this huge statewide plan. Well, I've actually met with the man who's responsible for writing that plan for about 2 hours. I've also met with every single member on the team that put that plan together, members of the American Planning Association. I met with members who are for it and against it. So I have a pretty clear picture. I've also done a lot of work on the internet to try to dig and put documentation together. So let me, first of all, dispel one notion. If you're looking for some great, big, fat conspiracy, you're not going to find one. Because everything that I'm going to show you tonight is out there. You can find it. It's there for you to look at yourself. Many of these things are being done in broad daylight. Terms like sustainable development. Does sustainable development automatically mean, oh my gosh, I'm going to lose my property? Well, let me tell you something. The idea of being sustainable and developing something is kind of important. Planners are not necessarily the bad guys. There's some planners out there that do very good work. So we can't lump them all together into some big box and say, oh, if you're a planner, you're no good. If it's smart growth, it's no good. And if it's Agenda 21, well, Agenda 21 is another story. But there is taking place in this country an intertwining of the legitimate and the ideological. That's what's taking place. We have things that are good, like smart growth. What in the world's wrong with smart growth? What in the world's wrong with sustainability? Those are all good things. But all of a sudden, those good things have been intertwined with an ideology that's not so good. So what we're required to do is the homework. And what I'm going to try to help you do tonight is unravel those so that you can make those distinctions for yourself. I don't want you to believe anything that I tell you tonight. Nothing. Except that I wasn't born in 1889. I just started back then. I don't want you to believe anything. I want you to go back and check it. And I will give you the sources and show you where I went to get my information so you can go and put it all together for yourself. So we're going to start our presentation. And it's called How Sustainable Development is Transforming Your Community. Now I'd like to introduce you to Betty Perry. Betty Perry is in Orem, Utah. Back in 2007, she was handcuffed and arrested. And you might notice on her nose there, she has a little mark. And where that mark comes from is because when they arrested her, she kind of, hit her nose on the steps, and that was the end result of that. Why was she arrested? Well, the code enforcement officers hauled her off because she was guilty of having a lawn that was dying. Down here we have Julie Bass. Julie Bass faced 93 days in jail in Oak Park, Michigan because she planted an organic garden in the front yard. Now Julie didn't just go and plant the garden. She realized that she didn't have all the money she needed, but she did want to feed her family well. So she checked it first. She said, can I have an organic garden? So she went to the mayor of the town. He said, yeah, that's fine. We don't care. She went to the town council. They said, you know, Julie, go ahead. That's fine with us. So she went and planted the garden, and about a month later, up comes code enforcement officers, and all of a sudden she's hauled off and faces 93 days in jail for something she didn't even know, an offense she didn't know she had. In Dade County, Miami, Florida, 1,500 people are losing their homes down there because the EPA, the local Department of Environmental Resource Management, has come in and declared a wetland, even though the Army Corps of Engineers says there's no wetland. And right now these people are fighting to try to win their homeland back. In King County, Washington, owners lost 65% of their property if they own 5 acres of land because of regulations that were set up that most of these people knew nothing about. At the time, 17,000 people marched to the town and county courthouse. Why? Because they wanted to try to win their property rights back. All over the United States, things like this are happening, but for the most part, we don't get an opportunity to see it. Outside of Los Angeles, in Llano, California, Jacques and Marcel Dupuy, that small home you see back there, that's something they built themselves. They didn't have a tremendous amount of money, but they got permission. They built this little home, and that was kind of where they were going to spend the rest of their days. Until code enforcement agents came along and they said that they needed a water treatment system in the backyard that they absolutely cannot afford. So they were then told, here's the choice. You either put the water treatment system in, or you're going to take the shack down one by brick by brick by brick. Even the officers who were there, and by the way, who were armed, these people came into her home, and then when the two ladies and gentlemen walked outside, there were armed code enforcement officers around there with their guns drawn. All because these two people didn't have a water treatment system. Today, that's gone. They were forced to dismantle that. And it's not just on a small scale. Out in Flathead County, Montana, a group called the Big Meadows Grazing Association decided to get involved with a thing called conservation easements. Now, you're going to hear a lot about that. I'll talk some more about conservation easements later this evening. And on the surface, there can be some good things in certain conservation easements. Again, I don't want to spell a picture here that, oh, if I hear the word conservation easement, I have to run in the other direction. No, if you hear the word conservation easement, you've got to say, wait, stop everything, I want to read the contract. That's the deal. So these people just are on, they had a repair to make on their property. It was going to cost about $80,000. The government stepped in and they said, you know what, we'll give you a conservation easement if you just give us some of your development rights, and in turn we'll give you a whole bunch of cash and we'll fix that $80,000 problem. Next thing you know, they got a bill for $500,000 for the $80,000 problem. Now their land is encumbered and they're on the verge of losing it, and the only thing that's happening is the value is dropping. This is happening throughout the United States of America at an increasingly alarming pace. And this is what I want to make people aware of and begin to address. In the United States of America, property rights matter. We have an unalienable right to life, liberty, and the pursuit of happiness. It says so right in our founding documents. This concept is so important that it's also in our U.S. Constitution. No person shall be deprived of life, liberty, or property without due process of law, nor shall private property be taken without just compensation. Now, private property means freedom. Other nations don't have the kind of private property rights that we do. You own private property for a little while, but ultimately you end up having to give it back to the government again. So in effect, you think you got a mortgage. What we would call a mortgage, in fact, is a lease. In other nations, land is so expensive that 50 and 60-year mortgages are typical. They'll go right through 2 generations before they can actually pay a house off. And even then, in countries like, let's say, Panama, the president of the country can actually come and just decide to confiscate the land whenever they want. Now, we don't have that in America. And one of the reasons is because our founding fathers said that property rights were critical. And let me try to put that in perspective and explain why they mean so much to our freedom and what makes America unique. We're all organic living beings. That means we need certain things in order for us to survive. If we don't have those things, then obviously we cannot survive. So one of those is the shelter that we have over our head, roofs that we have over our head. There needs to be at least a mechanism in society that I can own that free and clear, and it's mine. So this is my little castle where I get to spend my time, and nobody gets to tell me what I can or can't do there. That's fine, and that's always the way the United States has operated. All of a sudden, if that property is so encumbered that I can't do what I want, and I can no longer make my choices in my way, then I'm simply a serf on that property. And now I work for somebody else. And that slowly is beginning to happen in certain parts of the United States under certain circumstances. And well, that's the way we feel in America, that private property rights are so valuable. Everyone around the world absolutely does not feel that way. So now we're going to get into a sustainable development that you probably never heard of before. But we're going to go trace the roots of it. And we're going to go all the way back to 1976, the UN Conference on Human Settlements in Vancouver. And yes, there were people from the United States there. In fact, the future EPA administrator was there and signed off on what I'm going to show you right here. We have his signature, we have all that information. This is the preamble to action under land. Land, because of its unique nature and crucial role it plays in human settlements, cannot be treated as an ordinary asset, controlled by individuals, and subject to the pressures and inefficiencies of the marketplace. Private land ownership is also a principal instrument of accumulation and concentrations of wealth, and therefore contributes to social injustice. If unchecked, it may become a major obstacle in the planning and implementation of development schemes. Now, this statement that I just made is probably foreign to what most of us would ever even think of. And I really don't care what side of the aisle you come from, left, right, middle, or outer space, or wherever we are. It doesn't matter. This isn't the way we do things in the United States. But this is the way things were set up back in the UN back in 1976. So it didn't stop there, though. The concepts of this made their way into a report several years later, because the United Nations requested that a report be done using some of the principles from this Vancouver settlement to find a way to reduce poverty in the United States. So I want to introduce you to the two of the key players who put this report together. The report was requested in '83. It was finally written in 1987. It was delivered in '87. Oh, I'm sorry, I forgot to say this. Back up. Social justice, urban renewal, and development, the provision of decent dwellings and healthy conditions for the people can only be achieved if land is used in the interest of society as a whole. So now we're putting the interest of society ahead of the interest of an individual. Now that works in a lot of places in this world. In fact, it's probably the way most of the world works. But that's not the way we work here in the United States. Well, I talked about the two people I wanted to introduce you to who wrote that report. The first one was a lady named Gro Brundtland. Now, Gro's probably a very nice gal. She was the former Prime Minister of Norway. In fact, she was Prime Minister 3 times of Norway, so she was rather popular. She's also the Vice President of the World Socialist Party. Well, actually, I have nothing against socialists. I mean, it's a free world. If you want to be a socialist, go for it. It's not exactly the way I want to spend my life, but hey. Now, if you go on the website of the World Socialist Party here in the United States of America, I want you to understand what they say and what they think. This is critical, because if you're going to understand that other definition of sustainable development, not the one I taught, not the good one, where we just want to sustain things and have a healthy planet and we all want to live for a long time, leave a good place for our grandkids, not that one, this one. This is what's on the website. The World Socialist Party in the U.S. is part of a global socialist movement that believes capitalism cannot meet the needs of the majority of the people of the world, however progressive it might become. To meet these needs, capitalism must be replaced by socialism. Okay? And that's where the person who authored this report comes from. Her name is Gro Brundtland, and in fact the report ultimately was named after her. It's called the Brundtland Report. And you'll find it throughout documents of the EPA and various other federal agencies. But we'll get to that a little bit later. So that's one of the gals, one of the folks that wrote this report. I want to introduce you to another one of the two people who were key players. There are about 11 or 12 people altogether, but these are the two key players. Morris Strong. Now, Morris Strong is one of those behind-the-scenes guys. He's a really powerful player. He's a major figure. He was the former director of the UN Environment Program and also chairman of the World Wildlife Foundation. Now, Morris was kind of a wunderkind, I guess. By the time he was in his mid-20s, he was already the head of a major corporation in the Middle East that sold oil back and forth between Middle East countries, and managed to make quite a fortune for himself. Shortly thereafter, he became the head of Dome Petroleum in Canada. He is a Canadian by birth. He bought 200,000 acres of land in Colorado over the largest freshwater aquifer in the United States of America, and decided what he'd do is just pipe the water off to southwestern United States and make a whole fortune for himself, just with all the water that he controlled. But he got thrown out. And he got thrown out by environmentalists. And that's kind of interesting, because it was only 3 years before that he was the head of the United Nations Environment Program. So there's something here that's inconsistent. But in fact, this is the history. The guy has an extraordinarily traceable history, so it's really not hard to find out much about Morris. Now, you haven't heard about Morris too much lately. Anybody remember the oil for food scandal back in the mid-'80s? Right. Well, Morris was up to his nose in the oil for food scandal. So rather than face the guns and go to court, he just took off for China. So he lived in China for several years until the oil for food blew over. Now, what was he doing over there, and why China? Well, he's actually very good friends with the Chinese government. because his cousin was a member of the Chinese Army's People's Army. In fact, she was so well respected by Chairman Mao that when she died, she had a state funeral just in her honor. So he was pretty well embedded in there. He started a company over there called Chery, C-H-E-R-Y. And his job was to remove the United States of America as the #1 economic power in the world. He did not believe in capitalism, he believed in their form of it. So why do I spend all this time on Morris? Because these are two players that wrote a report that I'm about to show you. And if you write ever written a report on anything, a piece of you works its way into that. It's just natural. Read the newspaper. Do you think a newspaper is just, the facts man? No. These are opinions. People's heart and soul are in there. And some of that's good, and maybe some of it's not so good. Depends on how it all plays out. But part of us goes into these things. When Morris was the head of the environment program, he had a mission statement, and I would like you to try to kind of lock that up and remember this, because it's going to keep coming back. To provide the mission of the environment program is to provide leadership and encourage partnership in caring for the environment by inspiring, informing, and enabling nations and people to, are you ready? Here it is, to improve the quality of their life without compromising that of future generations. Now you are going to hear this come up again and again and again and again, and this is where it originated, back in UNEP. Well, they got together, and sure enough, they put together this report called Our Common Future. In fact, I have a copy of it right here. And yes, I have read this little guy from one end to the other. And in here, it defines sustainable development. It's in Chapter 2 in a book called Towards Sustainable Development. Makes sense. So, Towards Sustainable Development. Sustainable development is development that meets the needs of the present without compromising the ability of future generations to meet their own needs. Okay, and that sounds innocuous enough. In fact, it even sounds like a pretty good idea to me. But where did it come from? Morris. It came from Morris, and it made its way into this book. Not the definition of sustainability that you and I are thinking about, but a whole other one that hides an ideological agenda. Because we read through this book, their solution to eliminating poverty around the world was interesting. They tied it to the environment. They said that poverty is a major cause and effect of global environmental problems. So for the first time in history, what we said was, if we can control money, if we can create a socially equitable society, then we will be able to not only eliminate poverty, but we'll be able to respond to climate change, to this upcoming global warming. It was just on the radar back in the late 1980s. There was beginning to think of maybe global warming is being caused by mankind. That stuff was starting to feed into the system. Well, it was addressed here in this book already. And in this book, they talk about three things. They talk about social justice, they talk about economic prosperity, and they talk about environmental justice. Again, that goes by the name of 3 E's, social equity they call it today. So you're going to see these 3 E's popping up again and again and again. Well, this book, thank heavens, was nothing but a UN report written in 1987 at the end of 42nd Street there, probably written in the basement by a bunch of people. How many people here have ever actually read a United Nations report? One. Okay, well, congratulations. Most people have never read a United Nations report, and for the most part, it just sits there at the bottom of the UN and nobody looks at it anyway. So we don't have to worry about these kind of crazy thoughts that are in here. It's just the United Nations. So in that book, it said that there's wealth all around the world. It's come from these high-income nations, and what we need to do is transfer that to poorer nations of the world, and if we do that, then the world is going to be safe, poverty will begin to be eliminated, and we'll be safe from climate change. Now, where do you think they were getting that money from to give to the poor people of the world? Got a guess? Yeah, it's us. They're getting that money from the wealthy nations, of which we're at the top of the list, and transferring that to others, all to eliminate poverty and to prevent climate change. Now, that's all well and good, except remember that Vancouver settlement thing? It defined this whole thing about property. Part of our wealth is tied up in property. So what this book goes on is begins to define how we need to really start getting rid of that private property. Now when you and I think of sustainable development, I'm not thinking getting rid of my property. That's fine. I want to hold on to that, but I do want to have sustainable building and all those good things to protect us. Well, thank heavens, it's only a report, except that they called for an Earth Summit. And so 5 years later, sure enough, in Rio de Janeiro, Brazil, this time it was no longer 11 people sitting in the basement at the end of 42nd Street. 18,000 people showed up at the Earth Summit in Rio. And at that point, They took the ideas that came from that Vancouver settlement, those wacky ideas about how people shouldn't have private property, it should belong to society, that worked its way into this UN report called the Brundtland Commission, or Our Common Future, and it was codified in this book. So if somebody tells you there's no such thing as Agenda 21, tell them to go online, Google Agenda 21, United Nations, and you can download the whole book. Or you can just read it chapter by chapter. It just makes great evening reading. There's 40 chapters in here. And in the 40 chapters in this book, they define exactly what the United States is going to look like and what we have to do to manage all of humanity. Now, at the opening meeting of the Earth Summit in 1992, Morris stepped out on stage because he was the organizer. He was in charge of the whole thing. And when he walked out, remember when I walked out here, I said, "Gee, I really like those chi-chi burgers or cheese." Yeah, that was good stuff. That's not what Morris had to say. When Morris walked out on stage, this is what he said. "Current lifestyles and consumption patterns of the affluent middle class involving high meat intake, the use of fossil fuels, electrical appliances, home and workplace air conditioning, and suburban housing are not sustainable." And according to this book, which you can buy for 30 bucks or download, if it's not sustainable, it has to be reduced or eliminated. So they began to talk about what was not sustainable. Morris also said this, and I urge you to check this stuff. I'm going to give you a website you can go to. You can see where I got it, and then you go do your own homework on this stuff. "Isn't the only hope for the planet that the industrialized civilizations collapse? Isn't it our responsibility to bring that about?" He said that as the director of the United Nations Environmental Program. This is a sustainable development that we don't think about. I've talked to planners. They've never heard of any of this stuff. I've talked to sustainable builders. They don't even know what I'm talking about. They think this doesn't exist. I'm telling you, it not only exists, it's proliferating. This isn't coming off, this isn't, I'm not making this stuff up as I go along. Well, at the United Nations, if you look inside this book, it describes Agenda 21, I'm reading the first paragraph there. Agenda 21 is a comprehensive plan of action to be taken globally, nationally, and locally by organizations of the United Nations system, governments, and major groups in every area in which humans impact the environment. Well, that's good. You're going to have to worry about where I impact the environment. Where are all those places where we don't impact the environment? Right, exactly. There aren't a whole lot of them out there. So effectively, this is a massive program to undertake some kind of management over all of humanity, which is like lunacy, and we don't really have to worry about it because, well, it's still just a UN report. So, again, we're free. We don't have to worry about it. Okay. Well, prior to that meeting down there, one of the groups that actually helped establish that meeting, one was called ICLE. We'll talk about ICLE later on, and that was the UN Global Biodiversity Convention on Biological Diversity. And what they needed to do was to create a practical tool for translating the principles of that book that I just showed you, those 40 chapters, into reality. So they did. They did create a book that did it. It's called the Global Biodiversity Assessment. Now, if it takes this size book to write a report, and this size book to codify it, guess what it takes to develop a system that's going to manage all of humanity? That takes a few more pages. That takes this one. This is the Global Biodiversity Assessment. And yes, you can buy this too. I bought it. Have I read every single page of it? No, I have not. But I've read a lot of it. I've been through an awful lot of this thing. It's enough to tell you a few things about it. Remember, according to this group here, not the sustainable development that you and I think of when we think about protecting our environment for our kids, but according to this group, where are we? Oh, here we go. Certain things are unsustainable. In here on page 337, it tells you that skiing is unsustainable. Ponds in your backyard are unsustainable, on page 783. On page 350, it tells you that pastures to graze animals are unsustainable. And on page 970, any golfers in here? Well, you're going to have a rough time somewhere down the road if these guys get involved. Page 730 talks about highways. Highways are not sustainable. Ultimately, they have to give way to different modes of transportation so that you begin to eliminate the highway systems. Highway systems damage the environment so that it can't return to its natural state. Dams and rivers that have been straightened, where there's a bend and they were straightened by man, those bends have to go back the way they were before. That's on page 755 in here. Our legal system is unsustainable because it doesn't recognize the needs of the plants and the animals and the environment sufficiently to satisfy the needs to ultimately end up with this global objective here. And property rights are not sustainable. That's a big one, and it's on page 782. And that's been a theme that runs through this entire program, going all the way back to the 70s. So this isn't new stuff. This is the theme. There have been other meetings by the United Nations. The same theme has come forward. And that is that private property is far too precious to be allowed to stay in the hands of individual citizens. There needs to be some management, some ability for the public good, as opposed to just the private interest. Consumerism is unsustainable. You will find that on page 773. This is my workout program. I don't get a chance, so I keep looking at it. Page 773. And the reason consumerism is unsustainable is actually kind of simple. If I buy stuff, somebody's got to make the stuff. So if somebody makes that stuff, then they're using resources and therefore depleting the natural resources of the environment. So in order to protect the planet, I have to stop buying stuff. So the suggestion is, to get me to stop buying stuff, is to begin to lower my standard of living. But that'll never happen here, because how could you possibly lower the standard of living in the United States of America? I mean, this is the greatest country on earth, so thank heavens this is nothing but a UN report, and we'll never have to worry about it. That's the good news. And then over here, on page 771, the family unit is unsustainable. It's unsustainable for several reasons. Number one, it doesn't recognize the collective good sufficiently. And number two, there's just too darn many of them out there. According to this book, we can only support about 1 billion people on this planet. Anybody know how many there are right now? 7 billion, yes. I think if these guys get their way, but they never will. If these guys ever get their way, then we're going to be in a lot of trouble. So I don't know how they're going to get back to 7, and I heard we're headed for 10 or 12, so we better slow that down. Well, also, if you go ahead to page 993 in this book, it defines a program called the Wildlands Project. And the Wildlands Project, I'm going to set this down because I'm running out of steam holding that up. The Wildlands Project defines what the United States of America will look like when we return it to its natural vegetative state. Because the only way to eliminate poverty and to protect our natural resources, according to this definition of sustainable development, not the one that we all know and love and want to live with every day, the only way to begin to protect that is to move people off of land till we reach the point where human beings will not inhabit those red areas up there. So all this red you see in here, and all that red you see down there, those areas are core reserves where there's little to no human use that's allowed. Then you'll see these yellow areas around here, which are actually buffer zones. You don't actually live there, perhaps a few people might live there, but essentially that's to protect those core areas so that the habitats, the endangered species, can live and thrive within there and begin to return what to the United States to what it was. This is called a rewilding of the country. And it's the only way to save the planet. So where do you think we get to live? Well, we're those little black dots up there. So all of a sudden, instead of living in all these outlying areas here, we now begin to merge around these cities, and we live in these little black dots up there. So those become the urban areas, or the high densely developed urban habitats. Now, the way to do that is really very simple. We just need to begin to pass laws and regulations and so on and so forth that move people off of these rural areas and begin to move them into the more urban areas. But hey, that's not going to happen in the United States of America. Nobody's going to try to chase me out of my little house outside in the rural area and chase me into some high-dense urban development. I mean, that can't happen. So anyway, this was all stuff that was back here in the United Nations, and everything you've seen here is quite traceable. Oh, I did forget to mention, George Bush showed up at that show that day, back on June 3rd, back in 1992, and he actually did sign on to this thing. He agreed in principle to implement. He not only agreed in principle, he actually signed the Rio Declaration in 1992. Now, here's where you're going to hear a lot of talk. So let me straighten out the talk. People are going to say, well, that Rio Convention they had, that Earth Summit, there was no treaty. Well, actually, there were 2 treaties. That's wrong. There were 2 treaties that came out of it. But this that he signed was not a treaty. So therefore, we're told that, well, since it was like a soft treaty and just an agreement, it's not binding. Well, you're wrong. It is binding. Because here's how those soft agreements work. Once the President of the United States commits America, then in effect, we are obligated by international law not to do anything in opposition to that agreement. That's why, you ever heard of a thing called the Kyoto Protocol? It ain't called the Kyoto Treaty, and there's a reason why. Because by signing that, nations were obligated. So when Bill Clinton signed that, and it doesn't matter whether you're for it or against it, I'm completely neutral on it, I don't care one way or the other. But by signing it, the reality is he obligated the United States not to oppose it in any way. That's why the next president incoming, President Bush, went to the very unusual extent of unsigning us. He took our name off of that, not because it had no teeth. In fact, it did have teeth, but he wanted to begin to remove any opposition that we might be able to hold against it. Well, even that I just defined is a lot weaker than really creating some kind of teeth. Well, that wasn't long. On the first anniversary of the Rio Summit in June of 1993, Bill Clinton signed Executive Order 12852, in which he created the President's Council on Sustainable Development to begin implementation of Agenda 21 throughout the United States of America. In July, he then signed the Biodiversity Treaty. Again, these things all sound, what's wrong with biodiversity, what's wrong with sustainable development, it all sounds so neat and cozy and it's good stuff. I agree, it all does sound good, but there's another side that I'm asking you to research, to find more about that I've gone into. By that time, this stuff sounded really great. Sustainable development, how can you go wrong? So the 1997, the U.S. Conference of Mayors signed on through the Joint Center of Sustainable Communities. 2001, the National Governors Association endorsed SMART growth, which we'll go into in just a while, advancing statewide sustainable development. By 2011, Barack Obama signed Executive Order 13575, creating the White House Rural Council, which enabled implementation of sustainable development. Not the brand you and I are thinking of, but the other brand, in 16% of the United States of America. Now, the motto of Agenda 21, the definition of sustainable development in this book right here is development that meets the needs of the present without compromising the ability of future generations to meet their own needs. Begins to take on a different meaning, doesn't it? Suddenly it's not so benign any longer. Just how do we plan on protecting those future generations? Just what needs is that we don't want to compromise or do want to compromise? When you start to get into the weeds of it, it's not what you and I would normally think about. Because I, like you, well, you know, you're all too young for this, but I have grandkids out there, so I am worried about what we're leaving them. Well, they followed a pattern called the 3 E's. That became the 3 pillars upon which this whole program evolved. Social equity is basically the individual giving up the needs for the community. Economic prosperity has to do with 2 components. One is free markets, beginning to give way more to public-private partnerships, which have been around forever. And international wealth transfer. That was the part where we took the money away from the United States and we began to even the playing field somewhat by wealth around. And then environmental justice is where individual rights are subordinated to environmental needs. Now we're going to look at each one of those 3 with just a little bit of a closer eye here. Social equity. This is where laws or regulations begin to force individuals to give up their personal wants for the needs of the community. This is part of this guy right here. That's where it comes from. The fellow you're looking at here, a gentleman named Harvey Reuven. Remember his face because he's going to pop up again in a few minutes. He's a member of ICLE, which is a group that was one of the groups that rolls out this Agenda 21 version of sustainable development, not the version that we're thinking of. And he said individual rights will have to take a back seat to the collective in the process of implementing sustainable development. Now, I'm not making it up. Google it. You'll find out this is what the guy said. Individual rights have to take a back seat to the collective. Who talks like this? The collective? Back seats to the collective? Anybody from Eastern European nations here? Anybody from Estonia, Latvia, Lithuania? That's that kind of talk. Now, I'm not saying it's that bad. I'm not saying it isn't that bad. I'm saying this is kind of weird talk to be having in the United States of America. But that's what old Harvey believes in. The transfer of wealth. Economic prosperity has 2 components to it under this version of sustainable development. The transfer of wealth out of the United States of America. In Agenda 21, in the preamble, it says, the developmental and environmental objectives of Agenda 21 will require substantial flow of new and additional financial resources to developing countries. That's found in this. This is called the Rio Declaration. And I just copied it out of actually this book. I just set it up so it was neat. And I hope everybody, I don't know if everybody got copies of this or not. Anybody have a copy that has a little picture of a UN symbol on the upper left-hand corner? Well, if you have that, you can find this saying right in there. This is what the President signed on to, by the way, in 1992. This is what he agreed to. The Rio Declaration on Environment in Article 8 says, equity will be achieved through implementation of the international economic order and through transfers of resources to developing countries. We are not talking about foreign aid here. Heaven knows we give loads of foreign aid to nations, whether we have it or not. We seem to be more than willing to write out checks. That's not what we're talking about. We're talking about an illegitimate transfer of wealth. So how do you do that? How can you take money out of the United States of America and give it to another country? I mean, that's impossible. How could we possibly make that happen? Actually, it's very easy. What if I were to tie up all the drilling in the Gulf for an environmental cause, which may be a good one or a bad one, I'm not putting a value judgment on it. But what if I were just to do it? And then all of a sudden I said, you know what? I'm going to give $2 billion in loan guarantees to Brazil. And I know, oh wait, I got a better idea. Then I'll go to Brazil and I'll tell them, I want to be your best customer when it comes to buying all that oil you're going to drill. By the way, they use that money to build a deep water rig. It's even bigger than the one that went down, Deepwater Horizon rig that went down from BP. And it's also had the largest company, the largest single explosion ever of oil rigs. But hey, that's our money back in it. That's one way you get money out of the United States of America. Remember, how about if I bought 2 buses worth about $1.1 million each and I had them made in Canada instead of the United States? Did that do it? $2 million going right out there. What if I built a car and I gave hundreds of millions of dollars to a company to build a car and suddenly turns out we can only make it in Finland? Wow, but we would never do anything like that. So these are ways that we can move money out of the United States and into other places, and it's happening every single day. Well, that was only one part of economic prosperity. The other E on there, and again, I want to keep grounded here. I want to keep one foot on the ground as we go through this thing. I'm all for economic prosperity. I've been fortunate, I've been blessed, I have a company, like most of us here, I worked really hard to build it up and make a success of it. And I'm all for economic prosperity. I want everybody in this room to have 10 times the money that I have. I think that would be just great. Then you could probably afford to go to cheeseburgers if you had that much. Public-private partnerships. Public-private partnerships are unique, but they've been around a long time. These are corporations that have a unique arrangement with the federal government whereby they get certain deals and handouts and goodies. They get tax breaks, limited liabilities. They tend to be easy access to federal money. They often form monopolies, subsidies, large contracts. Now, there's nothing new about public-private partnerships. How many remember Robert Fulton? Remember that from school? We started Robert Fulton in the steamboat? Yep. Old Robert Fulton made a whole bunch of money for himself. You know how he made that money? Wasn't inventing the steamboat. It was running up and down the Hudson River. And the reason he made a whole bunch of money is because he didn't have any competition. And guess why he didn't have any competition? Because he cut a deal with Albany, and they said, okay, no problem, we won't let anybody else in here. And so nobody else did come along until Commodore Vanderbilt a few years later and finally busted the monopoly on it. But that's how public-private partnerships work. They're really good deals for the guy who's got the partnership. And we have them today. You might have heard of a little company called Solyndra. Remember that one? That was a public-private partnership. And that's how those deals work. You have the inside track, so you get the inside cash. It's a real easy deal. In fact, I just read that the court said they get to keep those big fat bonuses, even though they blew $500 million of our money. Now, I'm nothing against, some people have an inside track, some are more fortunate than others. I realize that. The playing field has never been equal, and I don't think the playing field necessarily should be equal in all things. However, what happens when you get too many PPPs is this. The free enterprise system suffers. Because I don't have a PPP. I don't have a special arrangement with people inside the government. I know them, and they're not going to give me special arrangements, trust me. So with we're stuck with the high taxes, we're stuck with normal liabilities, we have limited federal access, high competition, high cost of money, and essentially we struggle against these larger companies that get all these handouts. Look at what happens when you're a company like GE with Jeffrey Immelt. Isn't it unique that Jeffrey Immelt just happened to sit on the President's Council for Jobs, and he just happened to agree to buy 50,000 of the 100,000 run on that GM Volt that's selling like a dog. I think they sold maybe 2,000 or 3,000 of those cars the first year out of the gate. They can't get rid of the thing. Not that they might not be a good idea, and not that electric cars might not be the way of the future. In fact, I suspect they probably will be. But it's not a free market that we're talking about. This is a deal that people got cut. And that deal is coming out of your pocket and my pocket. The average cost for each one of those cars, I'm not going to tell you because the number's slipping me, but I mean it's astronomical. The amount of money that we pay for every one of those Volts to be manufactured, to be subsidized, and then be put on the road again, is a highly disturbing figure. Since I can't give the exact figure, I'm not going to give it to you, but I would say check it. Individual rights, environmental justice is where nature is placed over man. In the Rio Declaration, it says, Human beings are at the center of concerns for sustainable development. They are entitled to a healthy and productive life in harmony with nature. Doesn't that sound neat? It doesn't when you start to look at what it says. It sounds all good on the surface, but not when you begin to delve into it, it doesn't sound so good. Human beings are at the center of concerns for sustainable development. Well, okay, I guess depending on how you define sustainable development, maybe I could be, maybe I won't be. So, yeah, that's a neutral. I can wait around that one. But this one I have a lot of trouble with. I'm entitled to a healthy and productive life. I'm entitled? By who? The Rio Declaration? This guy told me in principle number 8 that I'm entitled? Excuse me. Frankly, I will entitle myself to a healthy lifestyle. I don't need somebody else doing that for me. Because the moment somebody else says you're entitled to a healthy lifestyle, they can also say you're not entitled to a healthy lifestyle. And that's not a good deal. The minute somebody says you're entitled to a health insurance policy, they get to tell you what it's going to look like, what you're going to pay for it, and when you can go and when you can't go. They're going to sit down with a doctor. You ever seen these things happening? Yeah, they're happening right here. Now, oh, I forgot to tell you. In here it says that everybody in the United States of America has to have a health insurance policy. Now, I'm not saying, I'm implying, I'm not saying that that's because of Agenda 21 that we have that. Maybe it is, I'm saying maybe it is and maybe it is. The reality is I don't know. I don't know. It is coincidental, but you know, what are you going to do? So, I don't want to be entitled to a lifestyle. I want to like make my own way, thank you. And I'm only entitled to that if I'm in harmony with nature. Well, that sounds good, but who gets to decide what harmony with nature is? Does that mean I sleep under an elm tree at night? What is that? I can't build a sandbox for my grandchild? I don't know what in harmony with nature means. And by the way, who gets to make that call? I don't want to be under the rule of the guy or the gal that gets to make that call, please. To achieve sustainable development, states should reduce and eliminate unsustainable patterns of production and consumption. That sounds logical also. I mean, I like that statement. To be in harmony, you know, to achieve sustainable development, you reduce unsustainable stuff. Except, I know what that unsustainable stuff is. It's not such a pretty picture any longer. This is not what you and I think of when we think about sustainable development or having a sustainable community. All good stuff. This isn't all such great stuff any longer. Well, it doesn't just stop there. Why is it that so many people have never heard of Agenda 21? I mean, I travel around the country, I travel to different places, and now it's starting to gain some popularity. But people say, wow, you know, what is this Agenda 21? This is all kind of wacky stuff. Well, there's a reason why people have never heard of it, and I'm going to show you that reason right now. J. Gary Lawrence was an advisor to the President's Council on Sustainable Development. We talked about the President's Council a few minutes ago. I have a manual here on it. He advised the President, and here's what he said. Participating in a United Nations advocated planning process would very likely bring out many who would actively work to defeat any elected official undertaking local Agenda 21. So we will call our process something else, such as comprehensive planning, growth management, or smart growth. That, my friends, is why you have never heard of Agenda 21. And you can find that by Googling the future of local Agenda 21 in the new millennium. You can download the whole report right here, and his statements are in here. In context. So if there's any fear that anything I'm saying might be pulled out of context, why don't you just download the whole report and read it? Because I'll tell you, the part I'm telling you is the good part. The more you read in here, the more disturbing this report becomes. Well, they did. They used names other than Agenda 21. They use names like smart growth, smart streets, visioning projects, consensus, open spaces, walkable communities, sustainable, you name it, your state, your town, whatever. Environmental justice, multi-use dwellings, greenways, open spaces. Now these are all common terms. That's the problem. These are things that have been around for sometimes 30 years, going back to the 1970s, even some of them go back to the 1960s. So these aren't particularly unusual terms. That's one reason why it's very hard to be in. Remember I said in the beginning you have to kind of make that distinction and disentangle, you know, the good stuff from the not so good stuff. Well, that's what we're trying to do. Because these, for the most part, are innocuous terms. But in the wrong hands, they're not innocuous. And then what happens even worse? What happens in the hands of somebody who just thinks they're doing a real good job for humanity? They're idealistic, they want to protect the planet, they're out there working real hard. I mean, I'm actually an environmentalist, I care about this environment, and many of the friends that I have are rabid environmentalists, but they see this stuff and they're not real happy about it. When you see a program, and it tends to do, it does this. It takes what is now called urban sprawl, urban areas, and it begins to move people out of those urban areas and into these high-density, multi-use urban dwellings. You've got a program that's probably very close to Agenda 21. Now, again, let me put some cautionary notes in here. I didn't say that every single time you have a plan that says we need to move out of the rural area and into a more high density or an urban area, that's automatically Agenda 21 at work and we have to go to town. I didn't say that. I said that all the makings are there, and that now your antenna ought to be going up, and you've got to go to meetings, you've got to check stuff out, you've got to start reading contracts and find out what's going on, and find out if you're going to lose property. Because very often, in fact more often than not, you are. Now I will say this, I've had opportunities to meet with these planners. And I've met with planners who were up to their eyeballs in Agenda 21, had no idea what they were doing. And when I showed them what's going on here, they said, well, actually this is the 4th plan we've done and they're all the same. Duh. I wonder why. So when you start to see that happening and those patterns emerge, you know, we must ask ourselves intelligent questions. So how can something like this happen in the United States? Remember, I'm just talking about the UN. So how did this get into our country? Well, it was very simple, actually. Bill Clinton signed the executive order that created the President's Council on Sustainable Development. One of 7 reports that came out looked like this. You can download it. In fact, if you look at that website at the bottom of that screen up there, clinton2.nara.gov/PCSD, you'll get to the President's Council on Sustainable Development. And you can download 7 reports, or you can buy them from the government printing office for a minuscule amount of money. So they're all there, you can all read them. Now, in this report, you see the italicized part up there on the screen, the President's Council on Sustainable Development was conceived to formulate recommendations for the implementation of Agenda 21. Yes, there is an Agenda 21. Yes, it is in the United States of America. And anybody who tries to say that it isn't, or it's just some vacuous treaty that has absolutely no teeth to it, they are 100% misinformed. They simply don't understand. Once the President got a hold of this thing, and for all that I know, his heart was in the right place. He just wanted to try to protect the environment. At that point, oops, okay. This is the document. I don't know if you can see that up there. This is the document that says the PCSD was conceived to formulate recommendations for the implementation of 21. This is on a website that I'll give you, and you can download. This document actually has 25 pages, but I wasn't going to put those here. So you can go on there, you can download all 25 pages and see what that report says. But this is put out by the UN, and it says clearly, President Clinton's Council on Sustainable Development was created for the express purpose of implementing a program to roll out Agenda 21 in the United States of America. But all he had to do then was put it into the federal agencies. Federal agencies, federal regulatory agencies write what? Regulatory agencies write regulations. And for all intents and purposes, a regulation has the power of law. That's how you get a law without passing a treaty. So don't let anybody tell you that the Agenda 21 had no teeth. It didn't have the kind of teeth it did under Bush's signature, but under Clinton's signature it gained it all as soon as it became an executive order, and it was then embedded down within the federal agencies. So it was in federal agencies, it was also embedded within various non-governmental organizations such as the American Planning Association, Institute for Sustainable Communities, and on, Public Trust for Public Land. We'll get into those in just a moment. But I want you to know that this stuff is real. John's not making this stuff up. I spent a year researching this and digging it out. You're looking at the Federal Register right now. The Federal Register is public domain. You can go and you can get it. This is page 45,000 of the 45,157 of the Public Register. This is the EPA's Sustainable Development Challenge Grant Program. You probably all heard of the Challenge Grant Program. But you probably didn't know that the purpose of it, or one of the purposes was it, to move toward Agenda 21. In the highlighted, yellow, you can see it there. The Sustainable Development Challenge Grant Program is also a step in implementing Agenda 21, the Global Plan of Action on Sustainable Development, signed by the U.S. at the Earth Summit in Rio de Janeiro in '92. Through the Sustainable Development Challenge Grant Program, EPA also intends to further the vision and goals of the President's Council on Sustainable Development, PCSD, created in 1993 by President Clinton. And what was the vision and goals? To roll out Agenda 21 in the United States of America. We know because we just saw that in the UN report. So, you know, it's just Now it's just connecting the dots. But that was back, this report was 1998. This was written in 1998. But this is in 1998, so maybe this stuff evaporated over the years, right? I mean, EPA's changed and so on and so forth. Well, how about January 3rd of 2012? Is that good enough? Let's go to January 3rd. This report, gosh, that's showing up there? Oh, not very well, is it? Okay, this report, and I urge you to Google this, it's called The Path Forward. And it comes from the Office of Research and Development, the United States Environmental Protection Agency in Washington, D.C. The report was released on January 3rd. It's a 7-page report. It is on my website, so you can go and you can just download it and read the entire report just to keep everything in context. I'm not sure I can read this. Hold on. Over here, the EPA's Path Forward has begun to address this need. It was the need to organize all the different agencies under one communication standard. The need for systematic incorporation by realigning the EPA's entire research enterprise around the concept of sustainability. Well, that's okay. We don't have a problem with sustainability. It's just this UN of sustainability. That's the challenge. That was the Brundtland Commission. You ready? Let's read the next one. We're going to recognize the widely used definition of sustainability outlined by the Brundtland Commission in 1987, meeting the needs of the current generation while preserving the ability of future generations to meet their own needs. To fully embrace this decision, the 3 commonly recognized pillars of sustainability, economy, environment, and society, have been systematically integrated into EPA's research portfolio. Let me tell you what this means in plain, simple English. The EPA has now changed the way they make their decisions. Their decisions are now based on sustainability. And what version of sustainability it is? The one I've just been describing to you all along. It was embedded back in '93 and it continues to grow. And this is here for everybody in the world to see. There's no conspiracy. This is out in the open. We're just not paying attention to it. Implementation was a piece of cake. Once the President's Council on Sustainable Development was formed, they took money and then they gave that to several different federal agencies. And they authorized those agencies then to take, in this case it was about $5 million through HUD, to give it to the American Planning Association. And the American Planning Association was then asked to create a legislative guidebook so everybody would be on the same page and we'd all be kind of doing the same stuff and following the same rules and regulations. That guidebook then was used throughout the United States of America and went into each individual community, and that's how you get from the United Nations in 1976 through 1987 to 1992 to the President's Council on Sustainable Development, through the federal agencies, and down into your backyard. And that's what's going on there today. Oh, by the way, that book looks a little bit different. This is the Growing Smart Legislative Guide. So when people come into your community and planners come in there and they plan and they say, well, you know what, I got this really cool idea. We need to move people out of the rural areas and into the urban areas. We need walkable communities. We need open spaces. We need rails to trails. We need to have some kind of a place where there's mixed-use housing. I know. Maybe we'll put a little retail shop on the bottom floor, and then we'll put some offices above that, and then we'll put a whole bunch of living quarters on top of that. This stuff's been going on for years. There's nothing new about it. It's been going on in the 60s, to the best of my knowledge. There's nothing new about it. What's changed is the rapidity, the volume, and the sheer magnitude of this taking place across the country. So, much of this has been implemented through federal agencies, as I just said. So a lot of these property acquisitions that are taking place are through federal agencies. I'll give you an example of a fellow in New Jersey. I just met this gentleman about 3 weeks ago. He sits on a town council down there. So you'd think he'd have a little bit of authority. Well, he didn't. Because all of a sudden the EPA came in and they took just a little stream in his backyard that barely qualifies as a stream. They came in, the EPA, and recategorized that, and then took 300 feet of buffer zone on either side of that stream. Now he's got, I think, 4 acres of land, was it? 4. He's got 4 acres of land. But along the whole perimeter of that runs this stream. So he just lost all his property. And the only thing he can do with that, he said, quote, is mow it. That's about it. Now what do you think he's got when he tries to sell that property? A lot less than he had before. Somebody might be willing to buy it, but he's got a lot less than he had before. So in essence, that property is no longer under his control. It's now controlled by the federal government because they redesignated a stream that I could walk across in my socks and probably not get wet. it's not just federal agencies, it's also NGOs that are doing this. NGOs have been around forever. I mean, I don't know if you know what they are. NGOs are these massive organizations. They have sometimes millions of different members, and they're extraordinarily powerful because they have a seat at the table of decision-making in these United Nations decisions. Very often, if there's a treaty drawn up by a foreign nation, they're the ones that have done the due diligence to put that together. So they're extraordinarily powerful. These groups that you're looking here, Worldwide Fund for Nature, World Resources Institute, International Union for Conservation of Nature, they're the groups that actually develop these plans that you see here in Agenda 21. And it's all within their documentation. You may have never heard of any of these, so they're the biggest, but you probably have heard of these groups. The Sierra Club, Waterman Society, the Nature Conservancy, the National Wildlife Federation. Now, let me just pause and, I want to keep everything grounded here. I'm not saying that everything the Nature Conservancy ever did was bad and robs people of their property rights. I'm not suggesting that for one moment. They've done some really fine things. There's parks, there's forests, there's lands that we need to have protected in the United States. We have some of the finest parks in the world right here. It's because of some of these groups that that's happened. So these are important groups, and they should be supported. But they're also engaged up to their eyeballs in this Agenda 21 stuff, which is a whole other thing. And in many cases, they're confiscating people's property and turning it over to federal agencies by doing what they call a flip, which I'll talk about when I get toward the end of this. ICLEI is another one of the non-government organizations that I talked about. They're a very prominent one. They don't work for the UN, they're not part of the UN, but they were tasked by the UN to basically mobilize and roll out Local Agenda 21 on a worldwide basis. So they created the Local Agenda 21 Planning Guide, and you can see their name right at the bottom of this thing, ICLEI, down here. So when ICLEI says, we have nothing to do with the United Nations, and when ICLEI goes to their website, they take UN off of that whole thing, as they did last summer. Well, you can go right through the guidebook, and by the way, I think you can still buy the guidebook, but you can definitely download it off the internet for free. And it talks all about the United States and what the plans are to do in the United States and how the urban development is going to change the face of ownership of land and begin to reduce resources so that the planet will be saved. And there's ICLEI's website, Sustainability Accelerated. And at the same time, last June, when I think was it your Representative Wiener out here was doing all those obscene things on the internet? Well, that was all going on. Well, everybody's were focused on that. I hope they weren't. Well, that was going on. In the background, President Obama signed Executive Order 13575. That gave the federal government authority over food, fiber, and energy for 16% of the country. Now that's a massive statement that I just made, but in effect, it implemented an Agenda 21 policy across all of rural America. Now, the way he did that was the White House Rural Council acts through all government agencies to coordinate federal engagement with all these different associations, agricultural groups, small business, education, healthcare providers, telecommunication services, and on and on and on. How does the federal government coordinate with a local agency? How do they do that? Do they make a phone call? Well, I don't know if it's illegal. I think it's quite legal. The way they coordinate with a local agency is through the pocketbook or control it. They either control it, mandate it, manage it, regulate it, or whatever. But if you think you're going to go up against the federal government, they're going to say, oh, well, gee, we really wanted to put that house over there rather than here, but okay, you guys go ahead and do it your way. That happens occasionally. But for the most part, no, that's not the way it works. When they come in and they coordinate, that's another word for managing and over-controlling. Because of that executive order, which you can read online, by the way, 13575, I urge you, it's 2 pages, it's really short and gets right to the point. It gave the executive branch of government power over the food production, the land use, and created a de facto cap-and-trade system for that 16% of the United States of America. It also interacts with urban communities at the same time. That's also in one of the sentences in there. So that's how you begin to lose your property rights when the government steps in and they're able to that easily take those over. There's other ways that we lose those rights. Sometimes we do it without even realizing it. It's one thing when the EPA comes in, or the Nature Conservancy comes in, or a conservation easement is set up. And again, EPA does good things. You know, not saying EPA is all bad. They do some good stuff too. But one way is planners or groups will come in and decide that, you know what, your area has a problem. You've got a transportation problem down here. You've got a population problem. We notice the town of ABC has a rapidly growing population. We need to do something about that. But when these groups come in, whether it's a non-government organization like ICLEI or certain planning groups with probably the best of intentions, when they come in and they start selling you on the idea that you've got this critical emergency that has to be addressed immediately, it's very often followed up with a survey. And here's where we get in trouble. These surveys are like a stacked deck. You know what I mean by stacked deck? Yeah, this is a stacked deck. I'm going to show you one of the surveys. This actually came from friends of ours that sent us down up in Carver, Massachusetts. And I don't know if you can read that up there or not. This is just a couple of questions. There's about 15 pages of this, and one question is more binding than the one before. The top one is, how important is the rural character of Carver? That's the town name. Well, what are you going to say? I don't care about my town? Well, yeah, at least it's going to be somewhat. So, okay, but that's kind of innocuous. That's all right. That doesn't mean anything. But the next one does. Because the next question refers to access to rivers and ponds, farmlands, land for outdoor activities, areas for outdoor education, and so on and so forth. List all these things, educational work, buffer zones between different areas. And it says, which of the following, you ready for this, would you feel should be protected or acquired? That's your choice in this survey. Do you want me to protect your land, or would you rather I just took the whole thing over and grabbed it for myself? Which would you prefer, madam? So where do you go with this? You only got three choices to say, well, okay, protect it, well, I guess you can acquire it, well, okay, I'm not going to answer it. Well, if you don't answer it, you don't get counted. So these are kind of surveys that are going out all across the country. Again, not every planner is doing this, not every member of the APA is doing this, but enough are that it's making an amazing dent toward accomplishing this, that map that I had up there on the screen a few minutes ago. We're getting really close to that. So once that survey is done, a report is generated. And when the report comes back, it's got a nice graph on there, right? It looks really, it usually shows up in the local newspaper or something, or it's online. It's, hey, you guys have to look at this stuff. Do you know that 79% of the people in your community want access to rivers and ponds? 68% want farmland and agricultural land protected. Land for active outdoor recreation and team sports is wanted by 63%. Well, that all sounds pretty impressive. And if I lived in the community, I'd say, well, that's what my neighbors want. I mean, I didn't really want that, but I guess everybody else does. I must be the lone guy that doesn't want that thing. Well, not really. If you look up on the board, how many people actually responded to the survey? 320, 318 people out of 9,700. Now, my math isn't the best, so I wrote it up there. It's 3%. 3% of the people actually said this is what they wanted. The other 97% either didn't respond or weren't even involved. But these programs in Carver, I can tell you on a personal basis, because I have spoken to the people up there, I've interacted with them up there, and we're trying to help them to just get some of this stuff out in the open and let them know their neighbors haven't all said this. This is the real things that are being approached with. Well, it's not just there. This idea of having a very few people involved in the process. At the same time that we're sending out literature saying we want everyone involved. I mean, look at this. Here's a plan from a little town out here called Copaig. I remember Copaig. I haven't been out here in a long time. I lived out here in Oakdale. Anybody know where Oakdale is? Yeah, years ago I lived out here in Oakdale, a beautiful little town on the South Shore. And I noticed a Copaig nearby. I just can't quite get where that is. But I do know this about Copaig. They put a plan together not long ago. And when that plan came together, it all talked about the most important partner is you. Well, that's all I want. That really is all we're talking about, and that's all I'm saying. We all want to be involved. And they said, the planners, you were involved. And sure enough, if you read the bottom, over 300 people were involved throughout the process, or participated throughout the process. Okay, that's cool. A healthy mix of people who live in the study area and those that use it for other purposes, but don't live in the area. They live in surrounding areas. So now we got 300 people involved, but they don't even all live there. Some of them are stakeholders. You know what a stakeholder is? It's not what you think. It's not your next door neighbor. It's not, oh, well, a stakeholder. Well, that's a guy who lives right there, so we all have an interest. Well, sometimes it is, but very often it's somebody who already bought into the program before it ever started. Very often that's the case. People have a financial interest in the outcome of it. But either way, well, we still had 300 people, and maybe we'll assume most of them were there. Maybe 250 of them were there, so that's not a bad deal, right? Anybody know how many people live in Copaig, Long Island? 18,000. 300 people, not all of whom even live there, out of 18,000. Now again, my math isn't great, but I think it was 1.5% or 2% or something like that. We're talking about 1.5% of the people were actually engaged in this process, and yet this whole thing moved forward. Now, 1.5% is fine if I'm taking a poll and I want to find out who's going to win in, you know, whatever the next state is, Michigan coming up. That's in a presidential election. That's just fine. But 1.5% is not very good when I'm trying to find out what the impact is going to be on my backyard if somebody implements a sustainable development program. It gets worse than this. I didn't bring it up here, but there was a Greenville program, I think it's called. And in Greenville, South Carolina, 340 people were members and attended these meetings on a regular basis. And you should have seen this. In the newspapers, they're saying, wow, you got to see the representation. Do you know how many people live in Greenville, South Carolina? 340 were there. The population is 450,000. 340 people made this decision for nearly 500,000 people. And now they fought back, and now they're trying to get out of all the stuff that took place down there, and then hopefully they're going to be able to be successful in being able to do that. So one way these things get implemented is because there's lousy representation. Now, I got to tell you something here. You might not want to hear this. It's not always the fault of the planner that there's no representation. Sometimes the community doesn't show up to these things. I've been at planning meetings, and there's 4 people sitting there. You got a community of 6,000 people, and nobody came. So we have to take it upon ourselves to take the responsibility to show up at these meetings to find out what's going on, to find out if this is a good idea or if it's a not very good idea. Well, there's a couple of things we have to watch out for in some of these plans, and I just want to clue you into them so you're aware of them ahead of time. One of them is a thing called the Precautionary Principle. And this appears in many plans across the United States, not all of them, but many of them. And here it is. Where threats of serious or irreversible harm to people or nature exist, anticipatory action will be taken to prevent damages to human and environmental health, even when full scientific certainty about cause and effect is not available. You got it? Even if I think you're a wetland, I can treat it as if it is a wetland. Remember I said those people down in southern Florida, Miami-Dade County, were losing their property? That's how they lost their property, a thing called the Precautionary Principle. That appears in the planning guide. But that's not the only place it appears. It's also back here, front pages of Agenda 21. Because if you go to Principle number 15, for those of you who have this flyer, or you can download it on the internet here. Principle 15, to protect the environment, the precautionary approach should be widely applied by states according to their capabilities. Where there are threats of serious or irreversible damage, lack of full scientific certainty shall not be used as a reason for postponing cost-effective measures to prevent environmental degradation. This idea of the precautionary principle was promoted through the President's Council on Sustainable Development. It now exists in all 25 federal agencies, and it's part of the planning process that those agencies use when they come in and part of their zoning processes. So this is something you're going to run into. But you think this is good? Wait to see the next one. This is called amortization of non-conforming uses, and it is chapter 8 of this. Well, actually, I'm sorry. It's chapter 8 of this one. There's 2 of these guys. It's chapter 8 of that. It devotes an entire chapter on amortization of non-conforming uses. Remember that part of the Constitution where it says you can't take my land away unless I'm reimbursed for it? Or you have a really good reason and then I get reimbursed for it? Well, check this one. But for homeowners who live in a community that adopts the guidebook's vision, this is the guidebook, Legislative Drawing Smart Legislative Guidebook. The APA, American Planning Association, amortization proposal means the extinguishing over time of their right to occupy their houses and without just compensation for loss of that property. How long they have before they must forfeit their homes would be completely up to the local government. Yes, these people, like the couple that I showed you in north of Los Angeles and Yaddo, California out there, they were forced out of their homes based on amortization of non-conforming principles. So if you think this isn't being practiced in the United States, it is. Now, the planners will tell you, well, this is kind of a last resort. Really? I don't want this to even be in the resort book. You know, I don't want to know that that's on the table at all. But it's there, and yes, your land can be taken away, and no, you're going to have an awful hard time stopping this. Once you've approved it, and that plan, your master plan has been changed, and that's part of the regulations. You have to fight City Hall to try to get it out of there. If it's done by the federal government, it's virtually impossible to get out of there. So if you think the Constitution is going to protect you, if you think you're going to have your civil rights are going to be protected, you got another thing coming. You're going to have a rough time because all these people are finding the same thing. It's like trying to move a mountain to get these things to change. Placing property rights at risk. Other ways that you lose property rights through grants and conservation easements. The first one is grant money. Grant money, for the most part, comes with strings attached. Remember we talked? Somebody know up there? Oh, okay. Sorry about that. All right, well, I didn't mean that. So. All right. Well, grant money comes with strings attached to it. That's how it works. Now, if you go to EPA, they'll say, or HUD, they'll say, well, no. This is not a tops-down program. It's not a blueprint. There's no strings that are attached to it. Really? Well, try this one. Try going to the Department of Housing and Urban Development, the HUD website, and download Notice of Funds Available for HUD's fiscal year 2010 and the other one for 2011, the Challenge Grant Programs. Download it and take a look. Take a look at page 11. It's going to tell you what your livable community is going to look like. It's going to tell you what the housing situation is going to look like, how far transportation is going to be from where you work. It's all defined in here. This money doesn't come with no strings attached. And the fact that the government says it comes with no strings attached is not what did you do? Can't legally act on that. It's not a legal statement. So what matters is the contract that you sign, the agreement. So before you get involved with some group that says, oh, we're going to get all this money for you, find out if there are strings attached. And if the guy that's giving you money says, well, there aren't any strings attached, well that's fine, but if you don't mind, I'd just like to check it over for myself. I don't think you're not being truthful. Maybe you don't know what's going on, but do you mind if I look at it first? Because when you look at it first, you're going to be surprised. Once you sign on for many of these programs, you're going to find that you have no control over what happens to your property after that. It's already covered. A second one is conservation easements. And again, I want to differentiate. Some conservation easements are fine. The way a conservation easement works is this. Let's suppose you own a piece of property. That piece of property is considered having a bundle of rights. Planners love to talk about this bundle of rights. You got all these rights. You can lease the property, sell the property, paint the house, come and go as you please, invite me to live wherever you want. So you got all these neat rights. You also have this development right. So what happens is, suppose with that piece of property you have, you say, well, I want to protect this to be sure that nobody's ever going to build a high-rise on that. And I'm from the government, and I'm here to help you. I'm from the government, and I walk in and I say, well, okay, I'll tell you what. If you just sell me that development right, I'll guarantee that nobody will ever build there, and I'll give you some tax breaks. You'll never have to pay certain taxes on it. You won't have to pay an inheritance tax, and I'll forgive you some of that stuff. It's going to be really good for you. And I'll give you a couple $100,000 on the side. Okay? Well, that sounds like a good deal. It's a win-win. I get to keep the land. Let's say it's a farm. You get to keep the farm, and I get the development rights. Guess what happens when you give up just that one itsy-bitsy little development right? Guess what happens? You gave up the whole Megillah. Give up the other one, but don't give up the development rights, because that's the deal. If I can't develop my territory, then my property, then I can't decide if I want to buy corn or plant corn or peas or wheat or barley or whatever it might be. I don't get to make that decision anymore. Somebody else makes it for me. So that trade-off limits what I'm able to do with my property. In legal terms, it's called a servient estate. Before, you were the dominant estate holder. You owned that thing. But the minute you gave up those development rights, you became the servient estate. So now you are subservient to somebody else. I don't know about you, but I don't like that word. That doesn't work really well for me. If that's my property, I want to own it. But when somebody comes in and they take over that property, then those rights now they go to whoever the trust was that took it over. Now, here's a little catch that you may not know about. Some groups flip these trusts. For instance, let's take a large group like the Nature Conservancy. In one trade, the Nature Conservancy brought a piece of property for the rights to the development rights for $1,200,000, and the next day he immediately flipped it over to the Department of Agriculture for $1,400,000. The deal was already done. It was a pre-deal, it was already set up, and so land trusts do this. Now, does every land trust do this? No. Does every deal work that way? No. But it did that time, and it does enough times that we need to be cautious and aware of these things. Remember that big meadows that I talked about in the very beginning? Well, they thought that they had a good deal with the federal government because the government was going to fix that $80,000 problem for nothing. Well, it turns out that the Ninth Circuit Court of Appeals said, you know, it doesn't matter what the federal government promised you. It only matters what's in the contract. And in the contract, it says the government can do pretty much anything they want. So here's another catch on certain conservation easements. There's some good conservation easements, and I'm going to tell you about those too. But on certain conservation easements, if I'm a land trust, and I'm capable of issuing a conservation or buying the development rights to your property and issuing a conservation easement, if I'm able to do that, then any other trust that's capable of creating a conservation easement, they can attack the plan. So you and I might have an agreement that might actually be working out for both of us. But a third party trust can come along and they can sue and say that's not fair. And then that third party can flip it over, let's say, to the government, and all of a sudden you're in business with the government. And when you do that, you now have a business arrangement in which you have to follow best practices. And the government keeps changing what best practices are. So planting that corn might look great in 2011, but all of a sudden by 2015 it's so expensive you've got to start selling tractors. And guess what happens when you try to sell the land or borrow money against it? It's a lot tougher because you've got all those restrictions. These are just some of the things that happen. Another one's called mitigation banking. It doesn't happen with everything, but it happens with enough that you need to be aware of it. Mitigation banking is you and I trade off in the land. Now all the trade rights, and I agree that you get to plant all the corn you want, no problem. But all of a sudden you go into a bank. And now there's another homeowner over here 500 miles away. They're also in the mitigation bank. And they were supposed to have a bird sanctuary. But they screwed the property up, and now the environment is destroyed, and it can no longer be a bird habitat. Guess what? I get to go back into the mitigation bank, and you're the lucky winner. You get to have a bird sanctuary there. So there's no guarantee that you're even going to end up with what you said. And these are all in contracts. It's not like this stuff is hidden. It's in the contract. And I got more news for you. They're not even that hard to read. This stuff is all in there. Now the only person, once you've given that conservation right out, that it pays to buy that property back at full price is the land trust. Because when they buy it, guess what happens to the conservation easement? It disappears. And now they're free to do with whatever that property they ever wanted to do. But are there good conservation easements and TDRs, trading and development rights? Yes, there's many of them that work very fine. For instance, I know some local communities in upstate New York where they have like these, I think they're 10 years, I'm not sure, 15 years? 10-year conservation easements. And they're proposed by the local township. And the local township says, you give us the rights to the property, and in turn you agree, not, we'll tell you can't plant certain things, you can't build there or build a housing unit there or something. And in turn, we'll forgive you your local taxes. You don't pay property taxes, or you get a reduction on them. And that's fine. And then the program is reviewed at the end of the 10 to 15 year period, so both parties can come back and decide what they want to do. See, the problem with a permanent, in perpetuity conservation easement is things change. Your needs change, society's needs change, technology changes, your children's needs and wants begin to differ, and income changes, everything shifts around. So there's no opportunity for you to shift with that because you're already locked in for in perpetuity. So in general, if it says in perpetuity, if you're going into business with the federal government or a conservation easement that wants something that's forever and ever, you probably ought to think twice about it, read it carefully, get yourself a good lawyer, and more often than not, you're going to find it's not going to work to your advantage. It'll work to your advantage in the short term, but not work to your advantage in the long term. Community visioning for most of these programs that we talk about are predetermined. I know they like to say that every plan is unique, and they are to a certain degree, but it's really like a Chinese menu. We just got to pick one from here and two from there, and they all end up they mostly end up in the same place. It's urban sprawl is the problem. We need to move people out of the outlying areas into the high-density areas, create these mixed-use dwellings, walkable communities, and spaces where we can all walk to work instead of having to drive. The idea is to eliminate cars. If you go out in Santa Cruz, California, some of the developments we've gone up there, they tell you can't have a car. You sign off. I cannot own a car if I'm going to live here. And that's the ultimate objective of this. Dade County, we talked about the 1,500 people losing their homes. What we didn't tell you is that the clerk of the court there was Harvey Rubin. Remember Harvey? He was the guy that said, these are the individuals are going to have to take a back seat to the collective in creating sustainable development. Well, he's the clerk of the court. So how far do you think these guys are going to get down there in Dade County? They're up against a rock. There's nothing that they can do, and they're fighting every day to try to stop this. It's been going on for years now. But there's also, I'm going to do real quick here, I want to go, this approach by the United Nations was not just through our communities and our land, it's also in our educational system. And I'm going to show you a couple of things here. If this doesn't disturb you, I don't know what will disturb you. But UNESCO agreed back in 2005 to create what was called the United Nations Decade of Education for Sustainable Development. And the goal was to integrate the principles, values, and practices of sustainable development into all aspects of the education and learning. In effect, well, hold on in effect. Read that next sentence, second paragraph. This educational effort will encourage changes in behavior that create a more sustainable future. Excuse me? Now, I have children. How many people send their kids to school to have their behavior changed? Yeah, I don't think so. That wasn't why they went there. Come home and tell me about math, reading, writing, arithmetic, but don't tell me you went to school to have your behavior changed. As a parent, that's my job to be doing that. If I'm not falling down the job, well, then we need to look further. Influencing our children. The UN Decade of Education for Sustainable Development, which is right here, this is the overview, the class overview, is nothing more than the 40 chapters of Agenda 21 put in language for children from kindergarten through 12th grade. That's all it is. And this was approved by the Department of Education back in 2005, and is now being implemented. I'm not saying it's in every single school. I'm saying it's been approved by the Department of Education for use in every single school. Some use it, some don't particularly use it. But inside here, it's not what you think. What children are being taught is consensus thinking as opposed to independent thinking. They're being taught that facts are man-made. I'm going to give you an example of where that comes from. They're talking about eliminating disagreement, and it's only okay to question certain ideas. This all came out of this manual, by the way. Here's some things that you cannot question in school if you follow this manual, which everyone does not, but an awful lot do. Wealth is socially unjust. So if this gentleman makes twice the money that I do, that's socially unjust. Not John has to work harder so I can earn as much as this man, but it's socially unjust. We have to take that man's money and we have to spread it around, and maybe even a little out of John too, so we're all making equal. That's taught in school. Man is destroying the environment, we're causing global warming, and women and girls are marginalized. And all this has been resolved through consensus. The experts have decided all these things. Now let me tell you something about global warming. Here's my theory on global warming. I don't really care whether it is or it isn't. Maybe it is, maybe it isn't. It's irrelevant to me. But here's what matters to me. What matters to me is that we're not allowed to question that. If you do, you're marginalized. You're demonized. You're made as an outcast to question it. It wasn't that long ago when Einstein's theory of relativity was questioned. A couple of scientists shot a beam from one town to another and they said, wow, it went faster than the speed of light. And the scientific community was all a wonder at, my God, have we disproven this theory? It was the most wonderful thing ever. Now, it didn't work out that way, but that's okay. They encourage that kind of stuff. I want people to be attacking the idea of man-made global warming every day, and if somebody says there's no such thing, I want you to be attacking that too. We're supposed to be questioning this stuff. And whatever happened to an hypothesis, by the way? I remember when I went to school, you had an idea, right? And then that idea, if you tested it out a few times, it became an hypothesis if it was any good. And then finally, after a few years, if that panned out, then it would become a theory. Einstein's relativity is nothing more than a theory. Whatever happened to a hypothesis of man-made global warming? Never happened. It just kind of jumps from somebody's idea. Bang, there it is. This is the whole thing. And don't you question it, because the science is settled. I know scientists, and let me tell you what they tell me. Science is never settled. Ever. So why in the world would this one be settled? It makes absolutely no sense. And why would you want to marginalize the people who want to challenge it? Don't you grow stronger from challenge? Doesn't the theory get stronger each time you prove it again and again? Children are being taught not to do that. They're also being taught things like connected math. This has also been approved by the Department of Education. Getting to know connected math. Because, and this is in the back of this book, this is for the 7th and 8th grades. Because the curriculum does not emphasize arithmetic computation done by hand, some connected math project students may not do as well on tests assessing computational skills. Really? I'm sending my kid to learn math and you're telling me he may not do so well in testing my computational skills? We believe that such a trade-off in favor of CMP is to the student's advantage in the world of work. What do you mean it's in favor of the program? I don't want it to be in favor of the program. I want it to be in favor of my kid. And that's not happening. It's in favor of the program in those schools where this is taught. This is not in every school in America, but it's in a lot of them, and it's approved for all of them. But you think that's the bad part? I'm going to give you the last one, and this is the bad part. This is also in this book, and it's being taught, and I do know school systems where they're using this book right now. They learn that mathematics is man-made. This is page 17 of this book. Mathematics is, let me see if I can pick it up here, is man-made, that it is arbitrary and good solutions are arrived at by consensus among those who are considered excellent. So we don't even know what the answer to that is unless an expert tells us first. That's the mush that our kids are being taught in many different schools in the country. Have you ever wondered why the United States spends more money on education than any other country on the planet, and yet our kids keep doing poorer and poorer and poorer? It's part of a program to make them, help them become compliant, to deal in consensus thinking. And the people that do this don't think it's a bad thing. They think that we need to think in terms of a global community. We need to think in terms of a kid being able to get out of school and go to work. That's it. It's school to work. Forget the part about thinking. Stop questioning global warming. Just accept my reality that it's real and move on and get a job. By the way, here's where you can go. Well, now you might think that all this stuff is just an accident. Maybe it was just like that crazy new math when I went to school, or I guess when my kids were going to school. When I went to school, I think they were still working on those little abacus things. But when they went to, maybe this is just a bad idea and it's going to go away, right? Well, it's not what's going to happen. And I'll show you that right now. This is from here. This is called Education for Sustainable Development Toolkit, and it's put together by Rosalind McEwen. She's one of those experts, the consensus that we're supposed to be listening to. Well, she's like at the top of the list. And here's what Rosalind has to say. Education is an essential tool for achieving sustainability. Here it comes. Generally, more highly educated people who have higher incomes consume more resources than poorly educated people who tend to have lower incomes. In this case, the more education increases the threat to sustainability. Now, you may laugh at it, you may chuckle at it, but the sad thing is, this is reality. And there are school systems that are following this philosophy in the United States, and benightedly so, unwittingly so. They think it's a good idea because the planet's got to be saved. It's collapsing. Global warming is going to wreck the thing. There'll be nothing left for the future. We're using too much oil, too many Earth's resources, so we're destroying the planet. We've got to stop this somehow. So that calls for drastic measures. So we'll dumb down the kids that are so stupid to push back when we give them these dumb ideas that are dumber than we think they are. We need to do something to stop this stuff, and the best way to stop it is at least be aware of it. Now, the good news is there's a lot of pushback on this now. People are becoming more aware. Remember, these are parallel things that are going on. These are parallel. There's nothing wrong with educating kids. There's nothing wrong with new math programs to try different things out. There's nothing wrong with theories. Maybe man is causing global warming. Maybe he isn't causing global warming. Well, let's dig in a little further and find out what the story is. I've heard things about global cooling that's coming up right now that we're completely unprepared for. And this looks like pretty interesting science. Why aren't kids looking at this stuff in school? So they're the generations that will come up with the new ideas. But that's not what we're looking. We're looking for followers in this kind of a system. As communities find out, in 2011, 54 communities across the country told ICLA goodbye. They threw them out and didn't want them doing any planning any longer. That includes Edmonds, Oklahoma, Montgomery County, PA, Monmouth and Somerset counties in New Jersey. Carroll County, Maryland abolished the Office of Sustainability. They not only abolished the Office of Sustainability, they paid off the contract of the director, they threw the guy out, and now they're suing the EPA. They're going after them because they're closing that. Florida has stopped their statewide smart growth initiative. Not that there's anything wrong with smart growth. When smart growth takes on the dimensions of what we're talking about here, there's nothing in the world wrong with smart growth. You have to make distinctions, folks. That's what I'm telling you. This isn't, oh, I see the word smart growth, and oh my God, that's Agenda 21. I'm not saying that. I'm saying you have to make distinctions and dig into it further and find out what the truth is. Ocean County, New Jersey issued a resolution condemning Agenda 21. They said, we want nothing to do with Agenda 21. They spell it out. Legislators are listening to us. I've met with many legislators in many different states, and I'm telling you, they're starting to get the message and they're starting to push back. Wisconsin legislature introduced bills enabling local governments to repeal comprehensive plans that alter the county's master plan. Bonner County, Idaho, there's somebody from Idaho here tonight, I know, established a property rights council. You can get in on that, by the way, in your own community, to protect private property rights from governmental activity. New Hampshire introduced legislation to protect citizens from warrantless intrusions by federal authorities on private land. And New Hampshire House Bill 1634 prohibits the state, counties, cities, and the towns from contracting with or expending money for or receiving any money from ICLA. In January 2012, the Republican National Committee unanimously approved a resolution that's also on the website I have there, that they expose and they condemn Agenda 21 and say stay away from this stuff. This is real. It's not tinfoil hat stuff. It's not some kind of a conspiracy. It's nothing more than a well-executed business plan. And it's being executed in the name of good stuff, so it's very hard for honest citizens, even planners and sustainable builders and good people, to differentiate the good stuff from the bad stuff. So that's where we come in. I'd like you to learn more. Don't take anything that I said, without checking it out. Look at it all. Check Agenda 21 Sustainable Development. I have a website that I set up. Actually, a young man from high school set this up for me because I could not have the ability to do it. But it's called didyouknowonline.com, and then click on Agenda 21, you get there. And you will find under there, I think 90%, if not all of the documents that I presented here tonight, they're there, and you can see them in their entirety, and you can go back to the original sources. Download the pamphlet called What You Can Do. That's on that Agenda 21 site. It tells you these are the things that you can do. And ask your legislators and public officials to author and support legislation that protects private property rights. What we have to begin doing, folks, is we have to attend meetings, attend council meetings, get involved in the local political process, ask lots and lots of questions, and read everything. Don't take for granted that just because somebody says the grant money has no strings, that in fact is the case. You've got to read these contracts for yourself and ask your legislators. I don't want you guys to sign off on anything until the community has a chance to look at it. And by the way, when you have, 450,000 people in the community, and 350 show up at a meeting, that's not enough to do business. That's 0.8%. That's not enough for us guys to move forward on any kind of a plan. In conclusion, our local communities are in peril because a small group of people seeks to convince us that unless we surrender our property and freedoms, unless we subsume our individual rights to the good of the community, the planet will not survive. But this is a false choice. For over 200 years, Americans protected our planet, our nation, and our liberties. As communities, we can pull together to create our own plans to improve the environment without the control of international groups and the seductive lure of easy federal grants. Together, we can save our environment, we can keep our rights, and we can keep our freedoms, and that's the real choice, working together. Ladies and gentlemen, thank you.
Beautiful, John.